I have heard a lot of people complimenting Fujimoto's writing of Chainsaw Man both on a character and a story front. In this video I want to take a look at probably the most important character in the entire series, the one who we follow throughout their journey as they attempt to discover that which they desire and live a fulfilled life. I am of course speaking about Denji, the main character and protagonist of the story. I have already done a video on why I believe Denji's goals are beautiful, but I have yet to do an in-depth analysis of his character, so that's what this video is going to be. It's going to probably one of the longest videos on my channel. How long? Well, I don't know yet, but it is going to be long. I apologize to anyone who either doesn't have the time or can't stand to listen to a made-up voice for so long. I don't blame you. For those of you who are coming along with me on this venture, I welcome you. This video is going to be broken down into several sections, including Denji's purpose both in and out of the story, an analysis how his character develops and changes over the course of the series, his relationships with other characters in the series, and what I somewhat arrogantly believe Totsuki Fujimoto was trying to do with this character. Of course, this will all be from the perspective of one man, a small speck within the fandom really. But if you agree or disagree with me, I hope to promote discussion on how we each perceive this character, so together we can get a better and more rounded perspective. But enough stalling, let's get into this, starting off with Denji's purpose. Outside of the narrative, Denji's purpose is quite obvious at first glance. He is the vehicle through which we experience the story, he is the character of whom we are following the journey. Almost everything we know about this world, we are learning along with Denji, and rarely in some cases from the perspective of others. Denji is the individual by whom we perceive other characters, actively altering how we might interpret the actions of one character over another by Denji's own perception of them. A character's motives which are unknown to Denji are usually unknown to us, once again with special exceptions being made, and thus all actions can only be judged from what Denji concludes their reasoning is. If Denji believes a character is good, we are more inclined to believe said character is good regardless of their actions or reasoning. A pretty clear example of that with the fandom is Rize, who once examined outside of the context of her and Denji's relationship is a pretty terrible person. But within such she becomes a much more likable character of whom from my observations many believe Denji should have or should end up with at the end of the story. My own option on Rize aside, this is pretty clearly a way for Fujimoto to obscure character morality by using Denji. Another example is Makima, another character whose morality is purposely made to be unreliable because of Denji's viewpoint. Because that is the purpose of Denji at the most basic level, he is there to be an unreliable narrator. And going beyond just how we perceive characters being altered by Denji's perception, we also have the world building to consider. With Denji acting as an outsider for the world, he is the one who requires everything be exampled to him so he can understand it, but depending on how he makes sense of such information can result in a skewing of our own understanding of the world, even more so when we don't have the first-hand recount and only Denji's words and thoughts to go off. This leaves potential holes in the world building, not that it's a bad thing, but rather it gives Fujimoto the chance to surprise us by uprooting what we initially thought to be set in stone laws. It allows him to possess a wider range of freedom with his story without breaking it, or creating plot holes, which are different to the holes in world build he has left himself, as they don't directly contradict what is true and what isn't. But I would go further than this and say Denji has much more purpose than that. He is a device through which Fujimoto is able to emphasize the very human traits which are a part of all of us. He is a representation of humanity within the story. This is accomplished through displaying traits which are a major part of what allowed humanity to grow and reach the point it is at now. Those traits including his ability to dream of a better life, even when in the worst situation. If it wasn't for this trait, humanity would never have gone beyond the forests of our ancestors, and it is only once he has obtained his dream, even without knowing it at the time, that he stops dreaming about a future, and only after it is taken away from him does his dream once again manifest as his purpose in life. Denji also demonstrates a remarkable amount of resilience and fortitude, even when placed into a terrible situation. If humanity had folded at the first hurdle, we wouldn't be here. Furthermore, Denji also has the purpose of being the individual we are able to get to view the weakness of humanity through. He serves the purpose of allowing Fujimoto to demonstrate that for all humanity's strength, no man is a mountain, and no human can stand alone against the world which seeks to do them harm. We see this most prevalently during the final section of the first arc when Denji is forced to confront his past, and deal with his future, and without the support of friends or family he crumbles under the weight and is essentially reduced to nothing but a beast, a being which is infinitely more powerful than his regular human self, using the term human more as a metaphorical sense here, but also lesser in regards to its ability to think and function as an individual. Adding on top of all of this, a purpose which Denji serves outside of the story, which I feel goes underappreciated and unrecognized because we are all just so used to it, but that being the fact he is the face of the series, he is the character which is associated with the series, and if you were to ask someone what the first thing they thought of upon asking them about Chainsaw Man, I can bet you it would be Denji, either in his human form or his hybrid form. Sure, some people might think of the violence and gore or the dark comedy, but certainly near the top would be Denji. Being the face of the manga, let alone one which has so rapidly gained attention and popularity as Chainsaw Man, isn't easy. It's not easy to come up with a character design that you can confidently stick on the front of your book which will both be recognizable, inviting, intriguing and instantly recognizable. Yet Denji accomplishes all of these feats with both the help of Fujimoto's art style and the fact that Denji's character design is brilliant because it is deceptively simple. By deceptively simple I mean that in concept a man with a chainsaw for a head and with chainsaw coming out of his arms isn't all that of a complex design. Honestly, no lie, I came up with something similar when I was a child, except it was a man who had a sword coming out the center of his face. But where it matters is that Fujimoto took that simple concept and made it something complex. By complex, Fujimoto created a character whose appearance both tells a story, is marketable and causes people to ask a question without people considering it silly or childish as they might do if, say, it was just a person with a knife sticking out their face. The fact that he chose a chainsaw, and additional the fact that he chose a chainsaw, an item not made for killing and can't possibly be used to kill cleanly, gives the audience a clear understanding of what the story will be before they even open the book, which is in my mind a good thing. It draws in those who would take interest and turns away those who would deride or otherwise undermine it. Now that is everything I wanted to say on Denji's purpose inside of the story. How long that took I'll figure out when I actually put this together. Now would be a good time to take a break and pause the video if you're busy. I assume this is going to be the shortest section of the video, but who knows? Well, the me from the future obviously. Now then, let us move on to what Denji's purpose is in the story. His purpose is something which changes throughout the story as it progresses, with his purpose altering depending on whom it is which is putting their desire and pressure upon him. At the beginning of the story, his purpose is to kill devils, to pay off his father's debt to the mafia and die like a dog. Not exactly awe-inspiring beginning or one which anyone would wish for, but it does hold a purpose. It shows us where Denji is from and the sort of world he is inhabiting. It also shows us that Denji isn't in control of his own destiny, something which is prevalent all the way up till the end of the first arc. This is also the first purpose which is tossed aside, and one which happens over the course of a very short time. This is a purpose which Denji was both aware of and accepted, which isn't something which happens often, as we will find out throughout this story. So, while this is the most mundane and seemingly helpless purpose Denji has served throughout the series, this one was vitally important to helping establish him as a character and molding him into the person he is today. Without this purpose the Denji we all know and love wouldn't exist. It also has the added benefit of setting up a story beat down the line for him, as he is forced to confront the child of one of those mafia bosses who sought to do him harm, an individual with a very different perspective on the events which went down. This is also the only purpose which allowed Pochita and Denji to meet. If not for this singular purpose the two of them would never have come to be, and Chainsaw Man as we know him wouldn't exist. So this to me is perhaps the single greatest purpose Denji has ever had, if only for the ramifications it caused. The next purpose which Denji served is one which was ongoing throughout the series, from before we even met Denji, and that is to act as an emotional support animal for Pochita. Funny considering Pochita is a dog and Denji is always compared to a dog. The thing is, Pochita, despite all his actions up till this point seemingly being done in Denji's favor, that doesn't mean that the pup hasn't had his own intentions for him and gained something out of the relationship. From what we learn about Pochita, he was an extremely powerful devil, possessing a seemingly unique ability to consume and erase other devils from existence. Not only that, but he seemed to exhibit a strange disposition towards others, as while he wanted to be hugged and embraced by another being, he was unable to keep himself from killing those he sought to embrace. So, this of course left the dog lonely, not to mention he was further isolated from others by the actions of Makima, who, rather than considering Pochita as an individual, she only recognized the idea of Chainsaw Man, the devil which caused a mess of everything that it did no matter how hard it tries. She actively promoted Pochita's isolation and emotional decay by attacking the Chainsaw Man and seeking to either control him and take away his individuality, or to be consumed by the Chainsaw Man, which would only further rob Pochita of anyone who would seek to interact with him. So, when Pochita made the contract with Denji to show him more of his dreams in exchange for reviving him, this was less about Pochita wanting to save Denji because they were friends, who may or may not have something to do with it, but more so being the fact that through Denji, Pochita could experience what it was like to not be alone, to embrace others without harming them. This is a purpose that Denji, for the most part, was unaware of. Certainly he knew that Pochita was watching him and seeking to push him into fulfilling his dreams, but he wasn't aware of the root behind that desire, and it is this purpose which drove Denji to perform acts which might have cost him his life, and it is also this purpose which brings upon him the ire of Makima. For without this purpose, Makima would have no need to harm Denji, no desire to harm him lest she seeks to waste her time upon someone unimportant to her plan. And Denji fulfills this purpose to the best of his ability, right up until we reach the reveal of Makima's intentions for him, whereupon he falters and Pochita in rage lashes out. Because that is the truth of the matter, the chainsaw berserker we see in the series isn't Denji but rather Pochita lashing out through Denji's body. The roles are reversed, with Pochita controlling the body and Denji only being capable of providing his input from the background, lashing out at the fact that Denji was no longer fulfilling his purpose to him of giving him the emotional comfort he was after. In the absolute bleakest ways of looking at this, Denji's purpose to Pochita was to be a sacrificial lamb, someone thrust into danger so that he could live in peace and comfort, and when the lamb no longer fulfills its purpose it is consumed and tossed aside, by a being it thought to be its friend. Yep, I am saying that Denji was an unknowing slave to the idea of providing Pochita emotional support and comfort, and was only brought back to serve that purpose both times Pochita intervenes to help him. The first being when Denji was cut up in the dumpster, where he pretty much says as much, and the second time being when, after forcefully taking control of Denji's body when placed into an extremely stressful situation and failing to act as an emotional support for Denji as he had been doing for him the entire series, he gets power to help rip him free from his depression so that he doesn't have to deal with the problems he has caused. This might just be the cruelest purpose Denji has ever had without even knowing it, condemned to support an individual who he thinks is a friend, with them being willing to both use him and not willing to put themselves forwards to help him when he is in need of their emotional support. I would even go as far as to say Pochita was negligent given the fact he knew what was behind the door, and rather than helping Denji overcome it in a safe and most importantly welcome environment, he left it to fester and so Makima could use it against him. And now I feel like some people who haven't watched my other videos or don't know me are going to be angry at how I have portrayed Pochita here, but I must add this is only my perception and I am a very pessimistic person when it comes to this series and view it like that. This is by no means definitive and you're free to think of him as the cute friendly dog as much as you like, and in fact I would love to hear about your option in the comments below, same with anything else I put into this video. Now after covering my backside with that, let's move on to his next purpose. Denji's purpose, the one which isn't made clear till the end of the series thus far, because it is keyed into another character objectives which were hidden from us, and that purpose was to be a puppet, a weapon and a tool for Makima to achieve her own end goals, which as we find out had little to do with Denji as an individual but rather had more to do with the fact that he was connected to Pochita, who was the chainsaw man she was after. This purpose of Denji's highlights once again the lack of control he has over his own life and how he is manipulated by people without him even being aware of it, a prevalent theme in this series thus far. This purpose also highlights that Denji is willing to completely give himself over, mind, body and almost spirit to another individual without knowing the full extent of what they have planned for him, marking him as a follower rather than a leader. This purpose, unknown to Denji, is one which guides almost everything he does up until the final few chapters of the arc post his meeting with Makima in the first place. Without it, Denji would never have become a devil hunter, would never have met Power, Aki, or any of the other colorful cast of characters we have come to love and, in some cases, hate, marking it as maybe the second most important purpose Denji serves in the entire story, or first depending on your own viewpoint. However, the fact remains, that Denji, despite having these purposes, never actually achieved any of them in full, which was what drove Makima to go to the extreme lengths that she did. He failed as a puppet as he wasn't as easily controlled as she had hoped, rather he acted in a way which was the complete opposite of what she was after, that being Chainsaw Man. He failed to be used as a weapon as he not only actively bonded with his enemies such as in the case with Reese, but in many cases he failed to deal with the efficiency and delicacy as what Makima perhaps expected from a weapon she would use to help save humanity from themselves and the world around them. He also lacked either the knowledge or ability to consume devils like Chainsaw Man, which effectively made him worthless to Makima as a weapon, which is what caused her to resort to her plan in the end, or at least that is my belief. He also did not make for a skilled tool, being both unquestionable book dumb, lacking resources of which Makima could take advantage of, possessing no innate unique traits which would mark him as valuable, and on top of all of that he was actively getting in the way of what she was after. This actually slides Denji in an additional role or purpose here. He is serving as an antagonist to Makima without even realizing it, indirectly causing her grand plan to be delayed and on top of that actively seeing to it that it may never come true. This fact alone recontextualizes Denji's actual purpose in the story, as rather than someone getting yanked around by the whims of others, he is a rabid dog that many will try to tame or otherwise neuter, but he continues to lash out without even knowing it, just like a wild beast, and like a wild beast no plan which has it at the center can be assured to go off without a hitch. The simple fact is that Denji is a weapon, but not Makima's weapon, rather it seems almost deliberate that he would become opposed to her at some point as their desires clash, and beneath all of Makima's own attempts to enforce a purpose onto him, he already had one which would lead him down a different path to her. It's almost as if the entire time Denji was being manipulated by Makima he was instinctively pulling on the chain, testing the tension and just waiting for a moment to break free, even when he was content to work for Makima, and might have even loved her in his own way. In my mind, the fact that Denji was so utterly terrible at fulfilling this purpose proves to me that despite what others might say about him, he isn't a simp, or to put it another way, he isn't whipped as some people like to conclude from his actions towards Makima throughout the series. And it all comes to a head when at the end of the series when Denji is forced to confront Makima, completely renouncing this purpose and pushing forwards to be his own purpose and to have his own future for himself without her interference. This purpose is the one which forced Denji to grow the most as a person, because without it he would never have suffered like he did, and he would never have come out a stronger, if more broken person that he now is. So for all the wrongdoings Makima did in her quest to use, break and even destroy Denji, she is the one which gave him a purpose and a path to a strength which could even defeat her and allow him to finally gain a slither of what it's like to be free, truly free for the first time in his life. Man, I love this series. Everything has purpose in some way or another, if you notice it or not. That reason is there and it all ties back to Denji in some way and his purpose in the story. Truly brilliant. I don't know how Fujimoto does it, really keeping all these storylines interwoven while at the same time using them to form a noose around Denji's neck, which gets tighter and tighter until he bites his way through it in blindingly gory fashion. But moving on we must. So the next purpose I want to talk about is the one involving power. What purpose does power give Denji? Well, the obvious one is that he served the purpose of getting her cat back, which was over and done with pretty quickly, but he also served an additional purpose, one which is vastly more important to not only Denji as a character but power herself. That purpose is to be a humanizing factor for power. Regardless of how you feel about their relationship or how it might develop, be it romantic, friendship or as a sort of sibling-like relationship, you cannot deny the fact that Denji had a vast impact on Power's development as a character. He was her first friend. Depending on how you feel about her and Aki's relationship, he might have been her only friend. The fact remains that without Denji in her life, Power is unlikely to ever have considered another life other than her own, or perhaps even her own, to have value. As for all her bluster about being the greatest, Power has issues regarding the point of living, if it is even worth putting in the effort to stay alive. Power throughout the series, I believe, is putting on a facade of strength, both to hide her own insecurities and to prevent herself from having to consider the fact that she is in fact worthless, and all lives are equally so. But then along comes Denji, good old Denji, with his overly trusting nature and willingness to both forgive and move past the bad things people have done to him so that he can move forwards. He is the first person to ever treat her like another human being, once again not a literal human being but the idea of one. Before that, Makima has no doubt treated her like a resource to be used for devil extermination, even going as far to threaten both her and Denji in the earlier parts of the series. So of course, Denji, by offering out his hand, regardless of if his reasoning for doing so was noble or not, was the spark which caused the greatest development in Power's character. Unfortunately it came before her untimely demise, but take what you can get, I suppose. Now, while considering all of this, it is also important to mention that this isn't a purpose Denji knew he had, and yet it is one which he fulfilled all the same, and it is also one which not even the person who gave him the purpose was aware they were doing, as Power wasn't aware that she needed someone to treat her like a person. She wasn't aware that what she had been lacking in her entire life was someone to reach out and take her hand, to hold her when she is at her worst and to laugh with her when she was at her best. Through fulfilling this purpose, Denji grows as a character noticeable as he starts to consider the feelings of others while putting aside his own wants and desires, a great moment of character development. But moving on to the next purpose he has in the series. Kishibe, the old man, the mentor character and yet strangely still alive despite that himself, also instills a purpose into Denji's character, that purpose being to defeat Makima, to make sure that she doesn't get her way and she isn't allowed to get away with what she has done and what she is doing. He is effectively using Denji as a weapon, just like how Makima wanted to use him, but unlike Makima he seems to be doing it more out of the desire to have humans have the right to still be humans, fears, and all. Denji's purpose is to defeat Makima and win the right for humanity to continue to exist in a way that they aren't forced to abandon their fears, because fear is something which makes humans able to reach even greater heights. Without fear we would never have gotten to where we are now and would never push us to go even further beyond what we already have. However, while Denji does in fact fulfill this purpose, he does it in a way which Kishibe couldn't have seen coming, and one which didn't require the aggression which he seemed to want to instill in Denji to push him to go after Makima full force. It is through the expression of this purpose that Denji is once again forced to grow as a person, confront his own feelings and make a choice on how he wants to take his life. This is the first time a purpose has been given to him, where he was asked how he would deal with it. This speaks to the fact Kishibe respects Denji perhaps more than anyone else in the series, as he left it up to Denji to decide how he would fix the problem without trying to push him one way or another. It was through this objective Denji had to confront his own morality. When he decided he had to kill Makima to move forwards, he was forced to deal with the fact Makima was a bad person, yet he still liked her and didn't wish any ill will upon her. He was forced to confront the fact that despite everything she has done to him, to his friends and to everyone else, he still liked her, but he couldn't do nothing, so he had to reach a conclusion which would both satisfy him emotionally as well as allow him to reach for the future he is seeking. The conclusion, as brutal as it was, it cements Denji's resolve to stand by those he cares about regardless of their actions against him, and it also tells us that he isn't someone who will abandon those close to him no matter how much they turn against him. He is very much a shonen hero in that regard. The choice to consume Makima, well, it is what finally made me conclude that Denji was someone who was beyond the viewpoint of a regular humans, and his mentality wasn't something which could be understood fully by someone who isn't looking from the same standpoint as him. The final purpose I'd like to talk about is one which has been bestowed onto him at the end of the series, and until the continuation arrives, we won't know how it turns out. We can only wait and see. That purpose being to raise the new control devil, to instill in her values which the previous incarnation Makima lacked. This purpose is to push Denji into a more mature and thoughtful role, one where he not only needs to think about himself but also another individual who he is responsible for how they will come to view the world and its people. To me, this is the most logical way that his progression could have gone, with Denji already having had a similar purpose when it comes to dealing with power, only now he has to do it while knowing that he is, and he must also be careful not to instill any negative traits into her, as she matures. It is not an understatement to say this is Denji's transition into being a parent, or at least an elder brother, almost in a sense taking up the role Aki had played for him as he guides Naruto along. And while we have yet to see how this purpose plays out, I have high hopes that it will come together in a way that leaves us all awed and once again with an even greater appreciation for the story and its characters, Denji especially, as he is pushed to show a side to himself he has never used before and also confront his past. Think about how he will raise a child when he himself is both still a child and was only ever shown the wrong way to do so. What I am saying is, I am looking forwards to seeing Denji fumble as a single parent, going from overprotective to a fumbling idiot, all while juggling the rest of his life. It will certainly be interesting to watch. Moving on to the next portion of the video, we have character development, looking into how Denji changed as a character from the beginning of the series right up until the end. I have split this down into snapshots of his character through his life thus far. Those 5 sections are the beginning, an early period in the story, a mid-period, closing in on the ending, and the actual end. Starting off at the beginning, when first introduced, Denji's character is one which primarily is molded by the life he has been forced to live up until that point in time. He has simple desires, only seeking to perhaps have something to place upon his bread which he eats and to maybe one day date a girl. He is also almost completely self-reliant, with Pochita acting more like a pet that he has to take care of and a tool he uses to get the job done rather than an actually supporting figure in his life. He is also weak in the sense that he doesn't believe things will get better and rather decides to dream about a life he might have rather than making plans for what he will do afterwards instead. It is a depressing thought to have, to be so utterly convinced your life won't ever get better that you would rather just sleep than to actually take steps to prepare for when it does get better. But he is still determined, as rather than simple lay down and die like some might do. He continues to push himself forwards despite believing it to be hopeless, giving him an inner strength, which rages against the unjust way he has been treated, something that he keeps with him all the way through the story. What really stands out to me at this point about Denji is despite his terrible situation he is willing to help out others, but at the same time he expects them to return the favor in kind, such as when he first made the deal with Pochita to have his blood in exchange for his help in defeating other devils, and when he told Pochita he could take his body once he died, providing that he fulfilled his dreams for him. The way Denji speaks about deals and uses them to gain a small portion of control over his life is very devil-like indeed, and actually makes him become a hybrid even more fitting for his character, as despite the fact that he only rarely makes use of this trait later on down the line, Making contracts is the lifeblood of devils, and it is what allows them to influence the world through people. Regardless, this is where it all began and where almost all of us first got an idea of what sort of story we are walking into, even if we weren't prepared for the hell that awaited us. Also, it should be noted this is probably one of the few times in the series when Denji wasn't actually depressed, which is an interesting fact to note, as this is when he was perhaps the most out of hope here, yet he was in a strange way fulfilled with it, up until the incident that brought this to an end came along anyway. Moving on to the early period of the story, this part of Denji's character emphasizes the fact that despite his life getting better, he isn't satisfied with it. He is seeking purpose and meaning in his life, as he no longer has one other than to exist and live a good life, which is a nebulous idea at best. After managing to get out of the dumpster fire that was his old life, Denji finds himself a wanderer, someone without anything to strive for any longer, having obtained that which he had been dreaming about for so long, namely, to live a better life. Without a goal, Denji is forced to confront the fact that his life now is far more structured than it ever has been, and that he has to now think about how his actions might influence those around him and himself. The responsibility of not only having to think of himself for the first time in his life, even if he is still being manipulated by Makima, and being without a purpose leads to him to seek out his own goals. First he goes along with his libido in search of something to once again give his life meaning, tapping into his carnal desires so he can outwardly ignore the real source of his problems. This of course doesn't go over too well, as not only does he find himself disappointed once he manages to reach the goal he was after and fulfill the carnal desire, but he is also then left empty and once again without purpose, only made worse by the fact that while he was chasing it, he was made to feel fulfilled, playing up the idea that chasing something is sometimes better than actually having it. This is also the point in the story when Denji first starts to display signs of depression, being listless after he achieved his goal. This is however mitigated by the efforts of Makima, who for reasons unknown decides to instill Denji with a new goal, one which she will use to break him down later. Perhaps she considered that him being depressed wouldn't allow him to grow a connection to those around him, and thus making he plan to destroy him fail. For whatever reason, we now have a Denji who is on a slippery path down to depression and is dealing with having another goal to strive for, only this one being far more obscure than just grabbing some boobies, and that being to make meaningful relationships with those around him, something he has never had before, and thus he has no idea how to do so, but for the time being it keeps him from sliding any further down the rabbit hole into that deep dark abyss which some never manage to claw their way out of. At the midsection of the story, we see Denji being content with his life, striving to move forwards, and perhaps for the first time since he was curled up in a ball with Pochita, actually being happy. It is at this point in the story that Denji has achieved the goal which Makima had given him, namely, to form meaningful relationships with Power and Aki, to the point that he even seems content to leave the past buried and dead where it belonged when he turned away from the door which Pochita had always been telling him not to open. To him at this point he has everything he could have wanted, a family, a job which keeps him both busy and active, he even has something to strive for which no longer seems out of his reach, namely Makima herself. His mental state is the happiest it has ever been, with a positive outlook and a level of ambition never before seen from him. We also see that Denji is now willing to make a sacrifice of his own happiness for the sake of those he cares about without expecting to do the same in kind, something which is a notable change from how he was at the beginning of the series, and in fact it marks him as becoming more human, a being with the capacity to care about others without expecting them to return that care simply because we are fond of them, foolish creatures that we are. This also shows us that despite great hardship and suffering, Denji isn't a person to dwell on the past if he can help it. Not only that, but it also highlights another part of his personality and how it's developed over the story, with that being both his attitude towards and around Aki, someone he initially had a rather strong dislike for. By this point he has come to not only respect him enough to do what he says, some of the time, which is more than what most people can say, but he has also begun to unconsciously view him as an elder brother figure, while this is the same with Power being viewed as a younger sister. she and Denji never had the rather intense dislike of one another that Denji and Aki had. Their relationship might be one of the most powerful emotional bonds in the entire series, more than Denji and Pochita, more than Denji and Makima, more than Denji and Power, and certainly more than Denji and Riz. It is because of this bond that Aki is the trigger for the next lot of character development that Denji goes through. And speaking of that development, nearing the ending of the series, we are left with a Denji who is broken, having told head over heels into a pit of despair and having almost completely broken down into a husk of a person he used to be. This might seem like backtracking in his character to how he was at the beginning, but rather this is a much more severely damaged Denji than what we started off with at the beginning of the series. This one has fully entered into his depression arc and he isn't getting out of it without some serious help, and it's an arc which I still firmly believe has yet to finish even by this point. He lost Aki, by his own hands, invoking a sense of worthlessness in his inability to save him from what he had become, a sense of utter and complete powerlessness at his own lack of ability in the face of someone you deeply care about. Dying isn't uncommon, and I can only imagine it feels significantly worse when you are responsible for their death, or if you think you are at least, because we know at this point Aki was already dead and the gun devil was just parading around in his body. But knowing that and being able to accept that are two different things from where Denji is standing. He is also dealing with losing someone he had a very strong connection to for the first time in his life. His father was an abusive drunk, so he doesn't count, and he really didn't know any of the other people long enough to truly get attached to any of them. Then we get the reveal of what is behind the door, and that only serves to further break Denji's now fragile psyche down. But perhaps even worse than that, is the death of Power, who he is indirectly responsible for. And then to add just a giant steaming pile of depression onto everything else, he gives himself over to Makima, because he is just tired of thinking, of having to deal with a life he was never prepared for, tired of having to feel the pain of loss which we all inevitably feel when someone we love dies, tired of feeling responsible for everything that goes wrong in his life. Denji is just tired of being alive, but at the same time doesn't want to off himself because he still clings onto the last remaining shreds of hope, which marks him as still retaining his innate strength, still pushing him to get back up and to go against Makima's desire to shatter him as a person, no matter how much suffering it might cause him. Something we could all do with more in our lives. Unfortunately, we can't all have such a wellspring of inner strength. And now we move on to the final part of the series, so we can see how Denji ended up. After having defeated Makima, having a new goal, or two rather, a refilled sense of resolve, he begins to move forwards in his life again. Not to say he has recovered from his trauma, but he is doing far better than one would expect for someone who has gone through the same experiences as he has. I wouldn't say that Denji is exactly happy at this point in his life, but rather he is able to hold himself together because he has something to strive for. He can push down the depression and ignore it so long as he can continue to clutch onto the small strands of hope that haven't been torn away from him just yet. He now has to deal with the idea of raising someone else, who is oddly enough a similar person to how he was at the beginning of the series, while also resolving him to prevent her becoming like him but also avoid becoming like Makima. The fact that he would even take on this role, without the possibility of a reward or a benefit, just goes to show how much he has changed from the beginning until now, and I am certain he will only continue to grow as a person as we read the remainder of the story that has yet to unfold. Now moving into relationships, with this I'll only be covering his relationship with 5 characters, those being Aki, Power, Kishibe, Kobani and of course Makima. These characters are the ones who he spends the most screen time with and have the biggest impact on him as a person and he on them, so without further ado let's get started. Beginning with Aki, their relationship is one which changes significantly the longer the two of them are left to interact with one another. Going from being antagonistic to one another, with them both seeking to gain the attention of Makima for one reason or another, as well as Aki's belief that Denji isn't taking his duties as a devil hunter seriously enough, thus getting under his skin as he has previously seen people die because of it, and at his core Aki is a soft person. Their progression isn't quick or painless however, and only really starts to change significantly once put under a stressful situation which forces them to come together in order to overcome it. From there they both continue to bond with one another, to the point that Aki feels happy to open up to Denji about his past and even bring him along on his visit to his family's grave, as well as spend some personal and quiet time alongside him without either of them getting on the other's nerves, which is a far cry from how they began. To say they became brothers in all but blood wouldn't be an incorrect assessment, as they do indeed treat each other like brothers and even come to respect one another. Denji of course has an effect on Aki as a person, both causing him to relax from his usually high-strung and serious persona into someone with a more relaxed and open-minded perspective, going so far as to change his stance on devils entirely, as at the beginning of the series he believed he would never be able to be friends with a devil. But this is clearly not true, as he not only befriends Denji, who is a hybrid, but he also gains an almost sisterly bond with Power, an individual he was perhaps even less fond of than Denji in the beginning. He also starts to actually take amusement out of Denji's antics, such as when they took turns kicking the katana man in the dick after having captured him, something that was both unprofessional but at the same time a clear sign of the effect Denji was having on him. Adding on top of this the fact that interacting with Denji and Power caused Aki to rethink his reason for living, something which he never would have done before, and he certainly wouldn't have ever given up on the chance to go after the gun devil just because someone he knew might get hurt. But this isn't all just Denji affecting Aki. Aki has his effect on Denji too, with Denji's development as a character being tied closely into his ever-deepening bond with Aki and the other characters around him. Perhaps the most obvious way in which Aki has affected Denji is in giving him a person of whom he believed he could put his trust in, someone that despite the fact that they were originally at odds with one another, he can respect and in turn trust that he won't be betrayed by him. This is something that Denji never had before, except for perhaps in the case of Pochita, of whom he didn't seem aware of the devil's level of intelligence, or at the very least they didn't seem to communicate together as Aki and Denji do. This has allowed Denji to open up and in turn trust even more people around him, for better or for worse, and it is usually for the worse in most cases, but you live and you learn. Get burned once and you're less likely to do that again. And of course, if we are talking about the relationship between Aki and Denji, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the fallout which occurs as a result of Makima's actions and the actions that other individual took. This is of course, when Aki is killed by the gun devil and subsequently has his corpse taken for a joyride by the gun devil after it was apparently significantly injured by the efforts of Makima and several others. When Denji is forced to kill this fiend running around with Aki's body, he is forced to completely shut himself down emotionally as he kills the person who means the world to him. After Aki's death, we see just what sort of a backlash losing him has on Denji's mental state and well-being, only serving to further stress their relationship had gone beyond just that of a roommate or colleague, as this is the trigger for Denji to fall into a true state of depression. One which not even interacting with Power or having everything he could ever have wanted provided to him could even begin to budge, and this is a beautiful representation of the sort of relationship that they struggled to build and the hollowness which is left behind once it crumbles. Power's initial relationship with Denji at first might not seem quite as bad as the one Denji had with Aki, where the two were actively fighting against one another at points, but I'd say that the two of them actually started off significantly worse. Power attempting to feed Denji to the Bat Devil in exchange for her cat, not only demonstrated a complete lack of care for his well-being but also a malicious side to her as well, which was unfortunately pointed towards Denji at that particular time. She used him as a pawn like most other people in the series had done at one point or another. So going from that, to the point where Power is laying her life on the line for him, where she openly cries for him and forces him to promise to come and find her again, it really is a remarkable display of character growth and relationship growth between them, even more so than Aki and Denji, as Aki at least had a soft side, whereas Power had a much more dark view on what a person's life was worth, viewing all lives as equally worthless, something which initially changed with her cat, but only truly came into fruition when she realized that despite that she couldn't just let Denji die. The effect Denji had on Power can't be understated as being one of the most beautiful displays of how to show character development brought on by the bonds formed between two people without them even seeming to notice it. Denji, for a lack of a better word, tamed the arrogant, self-centered blood devil and made her into a vicious and protective house cat. I truly believe that there is almost no situation in which Power wouldn't choose to give her own life in order to save Denji, because that is simply the extent of the affect he has had on her. I would also say that Power might have had one of the largest spikes in character development in the entire series because of Denji, as she is perhaps the only person to have her entire worldview shattered simply by getting to know him and spending time around him, something that no other character can possibly claim. Now on the other foot, how Power affects Denji. The idea is quite simple, with Power pushing Denji into being a more selfless person, someone who puts aside his own desires, goals, and enjoyment for the sake of someone that he cares about. She pushes him into being a more caring person, which is something he will need to be for him to succeed in the second part of the story, which is yet to come. And of course, we have to talk about the fallout from Power's own demise. If Aki's death was the trigger for the depression arc, Power's death was like Fujimoto looked at the shitstorm that was Denji's mental state and decided to just throw some gasoline on it and light it on fire, because this is the event that utterly shatters Denji's mind, leaving him as a puppet for Makima pretty much. It was only through her momentary return and the promise that she forced upon Denji that he was able to recover even slightly. If there was ever a moment in manga which showed that two people care about one another so much, it is when one of them is ready to lay down and die because the other isn't there anymore and is only able to pick themselves back up when that person gives them the strength to do so. Beautiful, really. Shame it had to die in a fire, or rather a dumpster. Moving on to his relationship with Kishibe, which can most easily be summed up as a teacher-student relationship with a twist, the twist being that the teacher intends to use the students as a weapon against a great enemy, and also the teacher frequently kills the student. Of course, they also affect one another, with Kishibe apparently getting soft the longer he spends with Denji. This might be just from the perspective who don't know him well enough or haven't spent enough time around him in the recent time. Of course, he has also forced change onto Denji, forcing him to confront his own wants and desires, as well as pushing him to make hard choices, as well as just shoving a kid onto him that he is going to have to raise so that they turn out right. I can see this relationship further developing to the point that we might get a Jiraiya-style death scene with him, just to want to make us all cry some more for these fictional made-up characters. Kobani, at the beginning of the story, seems like just another character being sent to the slaughterhouse, but little by little she forms an unstable and conflicting bond with Denji. Going from wanting to just off him so that she can escape from the clutches of another devil, displaying a complete lack of regard for his life and well-being, but after recovering from the event she actually starts to work towards helping him and is perhaps the closet thing Denji currently has to a friend, and vice versa, which is depressing as all hell. Denji's presence has caused a shift within Kobani, forcing her to be exposed to a great many horrors, which has slowly begun to unravel her mind as well as give her a greater tolerance for the madness of the world she is walking into. Example, when despite being treated like a plaything by Chainsaw Man, she slowly lost her fear of him. As for how Kobani affected Denji, the answer should be simple. It is her words which at the end push him to make the choice to fight Makima, force him to confront the idea that being normal isn't all it's cracked up to be, and force him to make his own path lest he ends up trapped just like her. For the future development between them, I could see her coming to help Denji raise Naruto if she wasn't one of the people killed off during the killing of Makima, that is. Now we get on to the big one, the relationship which screwed up Denji the most and almost ended the entire series outright. That relationship, of course, being the one which he had with Makima. This one is far more complex than any of the other relationship he has had up to this point. There is no clear progression to be seen with how they relate to one another, or rather there isn't one on the side of Makima at least. Denji on the other hand goes through some considerable shifts in options about Makima from the beginning of the series up until the end, bouncing back and forth between being infatuated with her and being upset with her in the beginning, moving towards pursuing her in a less than romantic sense, rather only seeking to get her attention so he can date a beautiful woman and live a life of comfort, fulfilling his original dreams. That being said, at the end of the series he has obtained a twisted sort of love for her, or at least that is how it seems given how his own inner monologues about Makima all have such a tinge to them. Makima on the other hand pretty much only ever had one goal, and that goal was to crush Denji so she could get Chainsaw Man back. Even up until the end she never forgot this fact, and as a result she never grew any closer to Denji, as everything was simply a mask to hide her intentions. The effect Denji has on Makima might not be obvious at first, given how their relationship doesn't develop and Makima continues to go on with her plans regardless of what he does. However, upon closer inspection there are some changes which occur as a result of her interactions with Denji, the most notable one being how she is forced to take on a more compassionate role, as at the beginning of the story Makima treated Denji more like a tool rather than a person. Throughout the series we see this slowly shift, as part of Makima's ever-evolving plan to gain Denji's trust and then crush him. As for how Makima was able to affect Denji, that is the most obvious thing in the world, as she has been manipulating him ever since they met, pushing him this way and that way so that she could get what she wanted. Up until the end, everything Denji did was for Makima, for the goal that is Makima, for the women that was Makima or who he thought she was. The fact of the matter is that without Makima's influence Denji would never have become the character he is now. And now with her gone, consumed by Denji as part of his twisted interpretation of love, how will that continue to play into his development I can't say, but I seriously doubt she won't play a role later in making Denji grow as a person. And now, here comes the arrogant part where I try to tell you what Fujimoto was trying to do with Denji's character. Of course, this is just my own option, like the rest of the video, but here we go. I'm going to try and dive into the author's mind. So here we go. What I feel that Fujimoto was attempting to do with Denji's character is to create someone who came from the worst possible background, someone who had suffered greatly to the point he was not only missing parts of himself but also lacking some key parts of what makes people, well, people, things such as an aversion to harming oneself or killing other people, because that's a normal thing. To not want to kill others that resemble yourself in some way is completely natural. Although sometimes I wonder if that's true, but let's not talk about how our world is messed up and instead focus on Chainsaw Man. Denji is a person who lacks these traits of humanity, and I believe that Fujimoto wanted to explore what a character like that would do when placed into extreme situations. I also believe that Fujimoto wanted a character who could go through such extreme traumas and go to such lengths without breaking, and for it to be believable if not realistic. I also believe that he wanted a character who wouldn't break down and sob at every character death in the series, because it would have just caused the pacing to be slowed down and for developments to be halted. But anywho, this has been my analysis of Denji's character, and I have been the Anonymous Weeb. Please feel free to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you're new and want to keep up to date when I post new content. If by some miracle you managed to sit through all of this, I thank you, and I would love to hear about what your own options on Denji's character are. Do you see him the same way I do? Do you vehemently disagree and think I'm an absolute dolt who doesn't understand the story at all? I want to hear it all, the good, the bad and the perhaps complete nonsense. Until next time, have a good day or night wherever you are.